The sewing scissors felt like ice against my palm as I gripped them, my back pressed against Marianne's bedroom door. Terror flooded my veins, not the gradual fear that had been building for months, but the sharp, crystalline panic of a mother who had just witnessed the unthinkable. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the makeshift weapon, but beneath the fear, something fiercer was awakening, a protective rage that burned away every trace of the submissive wife I had been just moments before. "Open this door, Josephine." Charles's voice drifted through the hallway with that eerily measured calm I had once found reassuring. "We need to discuss this rationally. Rationally." Behind me, I could hear my 5-year-old daughter's ragged breathing, and the sound shattered something fundamental in my chest. There was nothing rational about what I had just seen when I walked through that door. My husband, the respected bank manager, hunched over our little girl with his pants around his ankles while she pressed herself against the wall like a trapped animal. The fear that paralyzed me wasn't just about physical danger. It was the crushing realization that everything I thought I knew was a lie. The perfect marriage, the safe home, the bright future I had envisioned, all of it had been an elaborate stage set concealing a monster. But when Marianne had looked at me with those huge, devastated eyes, something primitive had exploded inside me. I would rather die than let him touch her again. The scissors steadied in my grip as his footsteps approached. For the first time in years, I felt powerful instead of powerless. The doorknob began to turn, and I raised the weapon higher, ready to use it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a small-town teacher found herself prepared to kill her own husband, you need to know the woman I was before, and how perfectly a predator had disguised himself as everything I had ever dreamed of finding. My name is Josephine Torres, though I was born Josephine Marie Hartwell on a bitter February morning in 1938 in the farming community of Millfield, Pennsylvania. I'm 87 years old now, and I've spent 50 years helping other women and children escape the hell I barely survived. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania during the 1940s meant accepting certain truths about a woman's place in the world. We were raised to be helpful, accommodating, and grateful for any man willing to care for us. My mother, Sarah, embodied these virtues while managing 7 people with quiet competence. "A woman's strength is like water, Josephine," she would tell me as we worked in her garden. "It finds a way around obstacles instead of fighting them head-on." I thought she was teaching me wisdom. I now understand she was teaching me to survive in a world that would later make me prey. Our farmhouse was small and crowded with thin walls that meant privacy was impossible. I was the middle child among 5 caught between brothers who saw me as invisible, and sisters who looked to me for protection I couldn't provide. What set me apart was my hunger for education. While my siblings accepted their predetermined roles, I devoured every book I could find. "And that girl's getting ideas above her station," Mrs. Patterson would whisper after church. "Too much learning makes women unmarriageable." But my father saw something different. "Study hard, little star," he would say when he found me reading by candlelight. "Education is armor no man can strip away." By 19, I had earned my teaching certificate miraculous for a farmer's daughter in 1957. Teaching gave me independence and purpose, but it also made me an anomaly. At 23, I remained unmarried while my peers tended multiple children, and the whispers followed me everywhere. "Ah, poor Josephine," the church ladies would sigh. "All that education has frightened away the decent men." The truth was, I had received several marriage proposals, but something in me recoiled from marrying just to satisfy expectations. I wanted what my parents had, a partnership built on genuine respect and affection. I should have paid more attention to how rare their marriage was and how easily the appearance of love could mask something monstrous. Charles Mitchell arrived in Millfield like something out of a romance novel. It was July 4th, 1960, and our town was celebrating with unusual grandeur thanks to the new bank branch. I was helping serve refreshments when I first noticed him, tall, well-dressed, moving through the crowd with easy confidence that set him apart from every local man. "That's the new accountant from Philadelphia," my friend Mary whispered. "College educated and unmarried. Every woman in 3 counties is trying to catch his eye." When Charles approached our booth with that warm, slightly nervous smile, something about his manner disarmed my usual caution. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "I don't believe I've met Millfield's famous teacher. I'm Charles Mitchell." The way he emphasized my professional identity, rather than treating me as just another unmarried woman, was like a key turning in a lock. "Josephine Hartwell," I replied, feeling a flutter when he took my hand, with perfect pressure, firm but not possessive. "I'm hardly famous." "Dedication like yours is rarer than it should be," he said with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. "I'd love to hear about your teaching methods sometime." The conversation revealed a man who seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He asked thoughtful questions, listened attentively, and shared observations that showed both intelligence and compassion. "You have quite a gift for making people comfortable," I observed after watching him charm our town's grumpiest resident into actually laughing. Something flickered across Charles's expression so quickly, I almost missed it. "I learned early that survival often depends on giving people what they need to see," he said quietly, then caught himself. His smile returned bright and charming. "But enough about me. Would you honor me with a dance?" I should have paid attention to that moment of vulnerability, to the hint that his facade might be concealing something complex. Instead, I was flattered by what seemed like honesty. "I'd like that very much," I said, and when he smiled, really smiled, not the practiced expression for everyone else, I felt something shift inside me like a door opening. Our courtship unfolded over 6 months with perfect romance. Charles brought thoughtful gifts, poetry books with passages marked in his handwriting, wildflowers from nearby fields, and once a delicate music box that played "Beautiful Dreamer." "This reminded me of you," he said when he gave it to me. Beautiful music waiting to be discovered by someone who appreciates it. He was the perfect gentleman, never pushing beyond chaste kisses, always maintaining respectful distance. Even my suspicious mother began to approve. "That young man has character in every gesture," she told me after his 3rd family dinner. "He listens when you speak and treats you like something precious." The entire community watched with approval. Here was proof my education hadn't ruined my prospects. It had prepared me for a better class of suitor. During evening walks, Charles talked about his vision for the future with earnestness that made my heart race. "I don't want just a career, Josephine," he would say. "I want to create something meaningful, a family that stands for something important, a legacy that improves the world." But when I asked about his past, his answers became vague and evasive. "I had to leave difficult circumstances in Philadelphia," he would say. "Sometimes a man must close the door on his past to become who he's meant to be." I interpreted his reticence as evidence of noble struggles, perhaps poverty he was too proud to discuss. I never considered he might be concealing something sinister. His proposal came on a snowy December evening after the Christmas pageant. Under the streetlight outside my house, he took my hands with tender reverence. "Sure, Josephine, I love you more than I thought possible," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me and help me build the life I've dreamed of?" Standing in the falling snow, I felt like a fairy tale heroine. This educated, ambitious man loved me for my mind and heart. "Yes," I whispered, and when he kissed me, I tasted the promise of everything I had wanted. If only I had understood that predators are experts at becoming exactly what their victims need them to be. Our wedding in March 1961 was everything I had dreamed of. The entire community celebrated our union, and I walked down the aisle feeling like I was stepping into paradise. Charles whispered that I was radiant, his eyes holding such apparent adoration that I felt beautiful for the first time. Our first year seemed to validate every optimistic prediction. Charles had rented us a charming house with modern conveniences, and he encouraged my continued teaching despite raised eyebrows from traditional wives. My Josephine has too much to offer to waste on housework alone, he would say. A confident man wants an intelligent wife, not just a housekeeper. Our evenings were filled with intellectual companionship I had always craved. Charles would read while I graded papers, and we discussed current events and educational theory with easy partnership. He took genuine interest in my students, remembering their names and asking about their progress. "How is little Susan progressing with reading comprehension?" he might ask. "Last week you mentioned her struggles." I felt valued and stimulated in ways I had never experienced. When friends complained about husbands who treated them like furniture, I counted my blessings. When I became pregnant 6 months after our wedding, Charles's joy seemed boundless. He immediately planned nursery arrangements and talked excitedly about our child's future. "If we have a daughter, she'll be brilliant like her mother," he would say, hand gentle on my belly. "If a son, I'll teach him to respect women properly, not like—" He would trail off, leaving implications I should have explored. The pregnancy was difficult, but Charles proved wonderfully attentive, handling household chores and caring for me with patient tenderness. "You're carrying our miracle," he would say when I apologized for not managing everything perfectly. "Nothing else matters." Marianne was born after 18 hours of labor. When I held her tiny and perfect, every moment of pain vanished. Charles wept when he first held his daughter, hands trembling as he traced her features. "She's absolutely perfect, Josephine," he whispered, voice choked. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Those early months were exhausting, but magical. Charles proved devoted, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at 3 a.m., singing lullabies in a sweet tenor I hadn't known he possessed. "Daddy's little princess," he would croon. "You'll have every opportunity, everything your father never had." When I returned to teaching after 4 months, Charles supported my decision despite community pressure for mothers to stay home. "You'd regret abandoning something you love," he said practically. "Your salary helps provide Marianne with opportunities." Life settled into rhythm that validated every choice. Charles received promotions for innovative customer service. I was appointed elementary department head. To everyone, including me, we were the perfect young family. But perfection, I would learn, is often a carefully constructed mask hiding something rotten underneath. The first crack appeared when Marianne was 18 months old. Charles had been promoted again, working longer hours and coming home increasingly stressed. What started as understandable work pressure gradually became something more troubling. "This house looks like a disaster," he observed one evening, surveying our living room with weary disappointment rather than anger. Marianne's toys scattered the floor, and laundry sat unfolded in a basket. "I'm sorry, darling," I said quickly, shifting Marianne while reaching for blocks. "She was fussy today, and parent conferences ran long." "I don't want excuses, Josephine." His use of my full name felt like ice water. "Other women manage households and children without chaos." The criticism stung because I had been struggling to balance teaching motherhood and housekeeping. I had considered reducing school hours, but Charles always emphasized my career's importance. "You're right," I said, hating my apologetic tone. "I'll ask Mrs. Henderson about housework help." "That would be wise." His tone softened, and he kissed my forehead with approaching tenderness. "I want our home to reflect our standards." He left for a walk, returning with wildflowers and apologies that seemed genuine. But the pattern was established: reasonable criticism followed by affectionate gestures that left me questioning whether I had overreacted. These incidents became more frequent and personal. Charles found subtle faults with my cooking appearance, parenting, and teaching methods. The criticism was never harsh, which made it more devastating than anger would have been. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Josie," he would say after pointing out perceived inadequacies. "I want us to be our best selves." Around this time, something else began bothering me: our new neighbor's increasing presence in our lives. Walter Hendricks was Charles's distant cousin who had moved to town to care for his ailing mother. He was a thin, pale man in his 50s, with watery blue eyes that seemed to watch everything with uncomfortable intensity. Walter had never married, and there was something about the way he looked at children, including Marianne, that made my skin crawl. When he visited, which became increasingly frequent, his eyes would follow my daughter around the room with intensity that made my maternal instincts scream warnings. "Walter's been helpful with banking matters," Charles explained when I mentioned my unease. "He has estate planning experience that's invaluable. I owe him gratitude." There was something in Charles's tone when discussing his cousin, a deference oddly out of character for my confident husband. When Walter visited, Charles became almost subservient, readily agreeing to suggestions he might question from anyone else. "Charles seems different when your cousin is here," I mentioned after Walter had stayed for dinner and spent unsettling time trying to coax Marianne onto his lap. "Walter has been through difficult times," Charles replied, his expression closing off. "Family loyalty requires accommodations, Josephine." But it wasn't just Charles's deference troubling me, it was how Walter looked at Marianne. His eyes followed her with intensity that made me want to snatch her away. When she toddled over with her doll, he would hold her two long hands, lingering inappropriately. "Uncle Walter gives me presents," Marianne told me after he visited while I was at school. She played with a new porcelain doll far too sophisticated for a 2-year-old. "That's nice, sweetheart," I said carefully. "What games do you play with Uncle Walter? Secret games?" she said, then looked worried. "But I can't tell. Uncle Walter says good girls keep secrets." My blood turned to ice. What kind of secret games? But she had turned back to her doll, and no gentle questioning could get her to elaborate. That evening, I tried discussing concerns with Charles, but his response was immediate and defensive. "Walter would never do anything inappropriate," he said firmly. "He's family, and he's been helpful and generous. I won't have you spreading unfounded suspicions about a kind man." "I'm not spreading anything," I protested. "I'm sharing concerns with my husband about our daughter's safety. Based on what? That he's unmarried? That he's kind to children? Those aren't crimes, and I'm disappointed you judge a good man so harshly." His reproach made me feel small and suspicious, as if my maternal instincts were evidence of uncharitable nature rather than protective wisdom. I found myself apologizing, though everything inside continued screaming warnings. Over following weeks, I began watching more carefully during Walter's visits, trying to catch definitive inappropriate behavior. But he was careful, never crossing obvious boundaries when I was present, maintaining the facade of devoted family member. The only evidence was Marianne's increasingly strange behavior after his visits. She would become withdrawn and clingy, refusing to play with elaborate toys he brought, sometimes waking with unexplained tears. "The shadow man comes in my dreams," she told me one morning, her face serious beyond her years. "He does things that make me scared and yucky inside." "What kind of things?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice calm despite alarm bells. "I can't say," she whispered. "It's a secret. Good girls don't tell secrets about shadow men." My suspicions about Walter crystallized into near certainty, but every attempt to discuss the situation with Charles met increasing resistance. "I won't listen to paranoid nonsense," he finally said. "Walter is family, he's been generous, and I won't have my wife poisoning our daughter's mind with unfounded fears." Our first real argument escalated with Charles accusing me of jealousy over family relationships, and me accusing him of caring more about loyalty than Marianne's welfare. We went to bed angry for the first time, and I lay awake wondering how to protect Marianne when my husband refused to see danger. What I didn't realize was that my laser focus on Walter as the threat had been deliberately cultivated by the real predator, the man lying beside me whose steady breathing masked the calculating mind of someone who had orchestrated my suspicions perfectly. As winter gave way to spring in 1964, my fears about Walter continued growing, while my relationship with Charles became increasingly strained. Every attempt to discuss concerns about his cousin met such fierce resistance that I began questioning my own perceptions. The doubt was corrosive, eating away at confidence in ways I didn't understand. Charles had always been my anchor, the one person whose judgment I trusted completely. If he couldn't see what seemed obvious, perhaps the problem lay in my suspicious nature. "You've been so tense lately, darling," Charles observed one evening as I graded papers while listening for sounds from Marianne's bedroom where Walter was supposedly reading bedtime stories. "This obsession with my cousin is affecting your health and our marriage." "I'm not obsessed," I protested, though even saying it made me wonder if it might be true. "I'm concerned about Marianne's safety." Based on what evidence that he brings gifts, enjoys spending time with her? Walter lost his chance for family when his fiancée died in that automobile accident. Marianne gives him a taste of fatherhood he'll never have. I think it's beautiful, not sinister. Charles's framing made my concerns seem petty and cruel. Here was a lonely man finding joy with his young cousin, and I was casting dark suspicions on innocent affection. But my maternal instincts continued screaming warnings I couldn't dismiss. The breaking point came on a warm April evening when I returned from a faculty meeting to find Walter alone with Marianne in our living room. Charles was nowhere to be seen, and something about the scene how Walter quickly moved away from where he'd been sitting beside her on the sofa, the guilt in his expression, how Marianne immediately ran to me with unusual desperation, confirmed my worst fears. Where is Charles?" I asked, pulling Marianne protectively against my legs. "He ran to the bank for paperwork," Walter said, his voice carrying nervous quality I'd never heard. "He asked me to watch little Marianne until you returned." "What were you doing while I was gone?" "Just playing games," he replied, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Nothing special. She's such a sweet child, so trusting and affectionate." Something in how he said trusting made my skin crawl. After he left, I knelt to Marianne's level, trying to keep my voice calm. "Did you have fun playing games with Uncle Walter?" She shook her head, lower lip trembling. "The games make me feel bad inside. But Uncle Walter says it's our special secret, and if I tell, nobody will believe me, because I'm just a little girl." My hands started shaking. "Marianne, you can tell Mommy anything. I will always believe you." But she buried her face against my shoulder and wouldn't say another word. When Charles returned 20 minutes later, I immediately confronted him about leaving Marianne alone with Walter, despite my repeatedly expressed concerns. "I trust my cousin completely," he said, his tone growing cold. "Frankly, Josephine, I'm tired of your unfounded paranoia. You're creating problems where none exist." "She told me the games make her feel bad," I said desperately. "She said Walter told her it was their secret and nobody would believe her if she told." "Children say all sorts of things," Charles replied dismissively. "They have vivid imaginations and often confuse dreams with reality. You're reading sinister meaning into innocent words." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to get definitive proof of what Walter was doing, even if it meant going behind Charles's back. Over the next weeks, I began my secret investigation. I arranged my schedule to come home unexpectedly during Walter's visits, hoping to catch inappropriate behavior Charles couldn't explain away. I questioned Marianne more directly, documenting her responses in a notebook I hid in my bedroom. What I discovered confirmed my fears. Walter had been gradually introducing inappropriate touching, disguised as games, swearing Marianne to secrecy, with threats that her parents would be angry if she told about their special time. But every time I presented evidence to Charles, he found ways to dismiss it or turn the conversation to my alleged instability. "You're becoming obsessed to the point of illness," he told me after I showed him my notebook of Marianne's statements. "This isn't healthy, Josephine. Perhaps you should speak to Dr. Collins about these paranoid thoughts." The suggestion that I needed psychiatric help was shocking. Was Charles really suggesting I was mentally ill or desperately avoiding uncomfortable truth about his cousin? As spring turned to summer, household tension became unbearable. Charles grew increasingly critical of everything I did, as if suspicions about Walter had contaminated every aspect of our relationship. Meanwhile, Marianne's behavior continued deteriorating. She became clingy and fearful, started wetting the bed again, and often spoke about the shadow man visiting her dreams. "I think we need time apart to gain perspective," Charles announced one July evening. I've arranged for you and Marianne to visit your sister in Ohio for 2 weeks. Perhaps distance will help you see how unreasonable you've become. The idea of leaving while Walter remained free to poison Charles's mind against me was terrifying, but I was too emotionally exhausted to fight. Maybe Charles was right. Maybe I had let fears spiral until I could no longer see clearly. But as I packed for Ohio, one thought kept echoing. If Walter was truly innocent, why was Charles so determined to prevent me from protecting our daughter? And why did I have the growing suspicion that I was being manipulated by someone far more cunning than I had given credit for? It wasn't until years later that I would understand the truth. My focus on Walter as the threat had been deliberately cultivated by the real predator who had used his own cousin as a red herring to deflect suspicion, while he built the foundation for crimes that would dwarf anything Walter might have contemplated. The master manipulator had been sitting beside me at dinner every night, kissing me goodnight and earning my trust, even as he plotted the destruction of our daughter's innocence. And I had been so focused on the wrong monster that I never thought to look for claw marks on the man who held me in his arms. Our 2 weeks in Ohio provided respite I hadn't realized I desperately needed. Away from constant tension of watching for Walter's behavior and arguing with Charles, I began seeing our situation with something approaching clarity. My sister Rebecca was a good listener, who let me pour out fears and frustrations without immediately offering solutions. As I described the deteriorating situation at home, she asked questions that forced me to examine details I'd been too close to see. It sounds like Charles has been very protective of this cousin," she observed one evening as we sat on her porch watching children play. "But what I don't understand is why he's so resistant to simply limiting Walter's access to Marianne while you investigate. Even if he thinks you're being overly cautious, wouldn't a loving husband err on the side of protecting his child?" The question crystallized something that had bothered me without my being able to articulate it. Charles wasn't just dismissing my concerns, he was actively working to discredit them and ensure Walter maintained unlimited access to our daughter. That seemed less like family loyalty and more like something else entirely. "Has Charles ever shown inappropriate interest in children himself?" Rebecca asked gently, and I immediately bristled. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "Charles is a wonderful father. He's never done anything questionable with Marianne." But even as I spoke, something nagged at the back of my mind, a collection of small observations I had dismissed because they came from the man I loved and trusted above all others. When we returned to Millfield in early August, I was determined to approach the Walter situation more strategically. Instead of confronting Charles directly, I decided to document everything carefully and perhaps consult with Dr. Collins or Sheriff Davis if I could gather enough evidence. But Walter was nowhere to be found. He decided to move back to Philadelphia. Charles explained when I asked about his cousin's absence. His mother's condition improved enough that she no longer needed constant care, and he felt it was time to rebuild his career in the city. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient, but I was so relieved by Walter's absence that I didn't question it thoroughly. For the first time in months, I could relax when Marianne was out of my sight, confident that the threat I had identified was no longer present. Our marriage seemed to improve dramatically with Walter gone. Charles returned to something resembling the loving husband I had married, and Marianne's behavior began to normalize as well. She stopped talking about the shadow man, her nightmares decreased, and she seemed to regain natural cheerfulness that had been missing. "See how much better everything is when you're not consumed with baseless fears?" Charles said one evening as we watched Marianne play contentedly with her dolls. "Walter's absence has done wonders for your peace of mind." I agreed, feeling foolish for having been so suspicious of a man who had ultimately done nothing more threatening than be awkward around children. Perhaps Charles had been right all along. Perhaps I had let protective instincts evolve into something approaching paranoia. But my relief was short-lived. 3 weeks after Walter's departure, Marianne's disturbing behaviors returned with a vengeance. The nightmares came back along with bedwetting and fearful clinging during daylight hours. She began talking about the shadow man again, and when I pressed gently for details, her descriptions were more specific and troubling than ever before. "The shadow man comes when you're not here, Mommy," she told me one morning as I braided her hair for school. "He says it's our special game, but it hurts and makes me feel scared inside." "When does the shadow man come, sweetheart? During the day or at night?"
"Sometimes at night when I'm sleeping. Sometimes when you're at the grocery store or at school meetings. He says if I tell anyone about our games, they won't love me anymore."
A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implication. Walter had been gone for weeks, but the abuse was continuing, which meant either my daughter was having elaborate fantasies about abuse that had never happened, or the real perpetrator was still in our house. The thought was so horrible, so completely unthinkable, that my mind recoiled immediately. Charles would never. He couldn't possibly. He was her father. He loved her. He had been trying to protect her from Walter just as much as I had. But once the seed of suspicion was planted, it grew with terrifying speed. Suddenly, details I had overlooked or misinterpreted began forming a different pattern entirely. Charles's insistence on bathing Marianne himself, even though she was old enough to wash herself with minimal supervision. The way he always volunteered to put her to bed, often staying in her room much longer than necessary. His resistance to my suggestion that we install a nightlight because he claimed it would interfere with her sleep. Most damning of all was his systematic campaign to discredit my concerns about Walter, not because he was protecting his cousin, but because he was protecting himself. By encouraging me to focus all suspicions on Walter, he had effectively diverted attention from his own crimes while simultaneously undermining my credibility as a witness. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping and nauseated in our kitchen, while Marianne played innocently in the next room. The man I had loved and trusted completely, the father of my child, the partner I had thought would protect our family from any threat, he was the threat. He was the monster I had been searching for in all the wrong places. But knowledge and proof were two different things entirely. Even if I could somehow confirm my suspicions, who would believe me? Charles was respected throughout our community, successful at the bank, active in our church. I was just his wife, a woman who had already demonstrated a tendency toward paranoid thinking about child abuse. The trap he had constructed was perfect in its cruelty. He had isolated me through my own love for him, discredited me through my own protective instincts, and trapped me through my own financial dependence. I was completely at his mercy, and he knew it. But as I stood in that kitchen watching my innocent daughter play with toys her abuser had bought her, I made a promise that would sustain me through the nightmare to come. I would find a way to protect her no matter what it cost me personally. I would become strong enough, smart enough, and brave enough to defeat the monster who wore my husband's face. I just had to figure out how to do it without getting us both killed in the process. The weeks following my terrible realization were among the most difficult of my life. I had to maintain the facade of a loving wife, while simultaneously investigating the man I shared a bed with, had to smile and make conversation, while my heart hammered with fear and revulsion every time he touched me. But I was no longer the naive woman who had married Charles Mitchell 4 years earlier. Motherhood and necessity had taught me to be cunning when survival required it, and I approached my investigation with methodical patience of someone who understood that one mistake could be fatal. I began by altering my schedule in small ways that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Instead of going directly home after school, I would sometimes stop at the grocery store or library, then return unexpectedly early. I volunteered for evening committees and weekend events, then canceled at the last minute to see how Charles and Marianne reacted to my sudden presence. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears while breaking my heart. On occasions when I returned earlier than expected, I would find Marianne withdrawn and fearful, clinging to me with desperate intensity that spoke of recent trauma. Charles would be perfectly calm and natural,
but there was something in his eyes, a wariness suggesting he knew exactly why I was really there. "You've been quite unpredictable lately," he mentioned one evening after I had canceled a parent-teacher conference to come home early. "Is everything all right at school? You seem anxious about something." "Just trying to be more present for Marianne," I replied carefully. "I feel like I've been working too much lately." That's very thoughtful," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I hope you're not going to make a habit of canceling professional commitments. Your reputation as a reliable teacher is important to our standing in the community." The subtle threat beneath his words was unmistakable. He was reminding me that my career, our social position, and our financial security all depended on his good opinion and community standing. One word from him about my becoming unstable or unreliable could destroy everything I had worked to build. But I also began noticing cracks in his performance, small moments when his mask slipped, to reveal the calculating predator underneath. The way his hand would linger on Marianne's body when he thought I wasn't watching. The particular tone of voice he used when speaking to her privately different from his public father voice. The books and magazines I found hidden in his study materials that made my stomach turn when I understood what they revealed about his true interests. Most damning of all was a conversation I overheard one evening when I returned from what Charles thought was an evening committee meeting. I slipped into the house through the back door and heard him talking to Marianne in her bedroom, his voice soft and coaxing in ways that made my blood run cold. "This is how daddies show their little girls they love them," he was saying. "But it has to be our special secret princess. Other people wouldn't understand how much daddy loves you. They might try to take you away from me if they knew about our special games." I stood frozen in our hallway, listening to my husband systematically destroy my daughter's innocence while manipulating her into silence about his crimes. The rage that filled me was so pure and powerful that for a moment I thought I might faint from the intensity. But I forced myself to retreat before he discovered my presence. I wasn't ready to confront him, yet didn't have enough evidence to ensure that justice would be served and Marianne would be protected. I needed more proof, more documentation, more of everything before I could risk making my move. That night, I began keeping a detailed journal of every suspicious incident, every telling comment, every piece of evidence I could gather. I hid it in the false bottom of my jewelry box, the same place where I had started keeping the small amount of money I was gradually saving from my household allowance. As autumn progressed into winter, I could feel Charles becoming suspicious of my behavior changes. He began questioning me more closely about my whereabouts, checking on my activities with persistence that felt increasingly threatening. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned she saw you at the library yesterday afternoon," he said one evening over dinner. "I thought you were grading papers at school." "I needed to research materials for lesson plans," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The school library doesn't have everything I need." "What kind of materials?" The question was asked casually, but there was steel underneath. Resources for teaching reading comprehension to struggling students. The lie came easily because I had prepared for exactly this kind of interrogation. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't entirely convinced, and I began to worry that my time for gathering evidence was running out. If Charles realized I suspected him, I had no doubt he would find ways to discredit me entirely, perhaps even have me committed as mentally unstable, leaving Marianne completely at his mercy. The crisis came in early April, on a night when I had told Charles I would be attending a school board meeting that actually wasn't scheduled to occur. Instead, I parked my car several blocks away and walked back to our house, planning to observe his interactions with Marianne when he thought he was completely safe from discovery. What I saw through our daughter's bedroom window was worse than anything I had imagined in my most horrible nightmares. Charles was not just abusing Marianne. He was photographing the abuse, creating permanent records of his crimes that could be used to ensure her silence for years to come. The sight of my husband positioning our terrified daughter for his camera while she sobbed silently was the moment I stopped being afraid and started being dangerous. I no longer cared about evidence or community standing or financial security. I cared only about stopping the monster who was destroying my child's innocence while creating materials that would haunt her for the rest of her life. I crept back to my car and drove to the school, establishing an alibi by stopping in my classroom to collect some papers before returning home at the expected time. But as I walked through our front door, calling out my usual greeting, I was no longer the frightened wife trying to gather proof of her suspicions. I was a mother preparing for war, and I would let nothing and no one prevent me from protecting my daughter, even if it meant destroying everything else in the process. The scissors were waiting in Marianne's room, left there from earlier mending work. And when I opened that door and saw Charles hunched over my baby girl, I knew exactly what I was prepared to do with them. The scene that greeted me when I pushed open Marianne's bedroom door was seared into my memory with the clarity of a lightning flash, every detail preserved in horrifying precision. Charles was positioned over our daughter on her small bed, his pants around his ankles, while 5-year-old Marianne pressed herself against the wall with her nightgown bunched up around her waist. Her face was streaked with silent tears, and her eyes held a look of resigned terror that told me this was far from the first time. What made the scene even more sickening was the camera on her dresser, its lens pointed toward the bed, and the scattered photographs nearby that showed this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of abuse and documentation. "Mommy," Marianne whispered when she saw me, the word coming out like a prayer for salvation that pierced my heart and filled me with rage so pure it felt like lightning in my veins. Charles turned toward me with nothing more than mild annoyance, as if I were interrupting a perfectly normal bedtime routine. "You're back early from your meeting," he said calmly, making no attempt to cover himself. "I thought the school board sessions always ran until 9:30. The casual tone, the complete lack of surprise or remorse told me everything. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was calculated behavior of a predator who felt so secure in his control that he saw no need to justify his actions. "Get away from her!" The words came out in a growl I didn't recognize as my own voice. Something primal and fierce had awakened the part of motherhood that would tear apart anything threatening her young. I moved between Charles and Marianne in one fluid motion, pulling her behind me, while keeping my eyes fixed on the monster wearing my husband's face. Charles stood slowly, pulling up his pants with deliberate movements, designed to demonstrate that he was not intimidated. "Now, Josephine, let's discuss this like reasonable adults," he began. "You're obviously upset." Reasonable. The word exploded from me like a scream. There is nothing reasonable about what I just saw. Nothing reasonable about those photographs. Nothing reasonable about what you've been doing to our daughter. His mask finally began to slip, revealing glimpses of the cold sociopath hiding behind the devoted husband facade. "She's my daughter too, and I'll raise her as I see fit. You have no authority to interfere with how I choose to show her affection." The words were so monstrous, so devoid of humanity, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about sexual abuse, it was about power control and the complete ownership he believed he had over both Marianne and me. Marianne ran to Richard's room and locked the door. I told my daughter without taking my eyes off Charles. "Stay there until Mommy comes for you." "She stays here," Charles commanded, stepping toward us with cold determination. "This is between you and me now, Josephine." But Marianne was already moving, slipping past us and running down the hallway. I heard the blessed sound of the door closing and the lock turning, and some of the tension left my shoulders, knowing she was temporarily safe. "You will never touch her again," I said, backing toward the hallway while keeping myself between Charles and the direction Marianne had gone. "I'm taking my children and leaving tonight." Charles laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Go ahead and try Josie. Who do you think they'll believe, me, the respected bank manager and devoted father, or you, the hysterical wife, who's obviously having some kind of mental breakdown. He was right, and we both knew it. In 1969, in a small town where his reputation was unassailable, my word against his would be no contest. The photographs might provide evidence, but they could easily disappear. "I know what I saw," I said, continuing to back away from him. "What photographs?" he asked, with a smile that made my blood freeze. "I don't see any photographs. Sometimes traumatic stress makes people imagine things that aren't really there." As he spoke, I could see him calculating distances, planning his next move. He was larger and stronger, and if he managed to overpower me and destroy the evidence, I would have nothing left but accusations he could easily discredit. But as I backed into the hallway, my hand brushed against something solid on Marianne's dresser. The sewing scissors I had left there earlier. I grabbed them without thinking, turning to face Charles with the sharp points extended toward his chest. "Stay away from me and my children." For the first time since I had entered that room, Charles looked genuinely surprised. His eyes narrowed as he assessed this new development, clearly trying to determine whether I had the courage to actually use the weapon I was holding. "What do you think you're going to do with those, Josie? Stab your own husband, if I have to." And in that moment, I meant it completely. I would kill him before I let him touch Marianne again. We stared at each other across the small bedroom predator and prey locked in perfect understanding. He knew I was serious, and I knew he was calculating whether he could disarm me before I could hurt him. That's when we heard pounding on the front door and children's voices calling for help. In my focus on the horror inside our house, I had forgotten that Richard's bedroom window faced the street and that Marianne was resourceful enough to climb out and run for assistance. "Mrs. Catherine, help us, help us." Marianne's voice carried clearly through the night air, along with Richard's confused crying. Charles's face went pale as he realized his perfect control had shattered. In teaching Marianne to keep their special games secret, he had underestimated a child's instinct to cry out for protection when faced with genuine terror. "Damn it," he muttered, and in that moment of distraction, I ran. I made it to Richard's room just as Mrs. Catherine and her husband burst through our front door, followed by Sheriff Davis and 2 other men. Within minutes, our living room filled with concerned neighbors and authority figures. Charles appeared in the hallway, now fully dressed, and composed every inch the concerned husband dealing with his wife's apparent breakdown. "Thank God you're here," he said to Sheriff Davis with perfect sincerity. "Josephine has been having some kind of episode. She attacked me with scissors." "He was raping Marianne," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his lies. "I caught him in her bedroom abusing our daughter and taking photographs of it." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see doubt and disbelief in their faces, the reluctance to accept such a horrible accusation against a respected man. Then Marianne spoke from where she stood, pressed against Mrs. Catherine's legs, her small voice carrying with perfect clarity. "Daddy does bad things to me when Mommy's not here. He takes pictures and says it's our secret, but secrets aren't supposed to make you hurt and cry." In that moment, faced with the absolute truth in a child's eyes and the devastating simplicity of her words, everyone in that room understood that I was telling the truth. Sheriff Davis stepped forward, his expression grim. "Charles Mitchell, you're under arrest." The trial 8 months later became a media sensation. Charles hired an expensive defense attorney who painted me as an unstable woman seeking revenge through false accusations. But prosecutor Elizabeth Harper presented the evidence with devastating clarity. The photographs Sheriff Davis found in Charles's study provided undeniable proof, dozens of images documenting months of systematic abuse. There were also journals revealing plans to expand his crimes to Richard as our son grew older. Most sickening was the discovery that Walter had never been a threat. Charles had deliberately manipulated me into suspecting his cousin, feeding my fears as a way to deflect attention from his own crimes, while discrediting me as paranoid. Your husband orchestrated one of the most sophisticated gaslighting campaigns I've ever seen," Sheriff Davis explained. He used your protective instincts against you, making you doubt your perceptions while creating perfect cover for his activities. The most powerful moment came when Marianne, now 6, testified in the judge's chambers. Elizabeth later described my daughter's quiet courage. "She was so small in that witness chair," Elizabeth told me afterward, tears streaming down her face. "But she answered every question with such clarity. When the defense attorney tried to confuse her about the timeline, she said, 'I remember because it started after Uncle Walter stopped coming, and Daddy said now we could play our special games without anyone bothering us.'" Those words revealed the final piece of Charles's deception. He had waited until Walter left town to escalate his abuse, knowing suspicion would initially fall on his cousin, and that my previous paranoid behavior would make future accusations seem less credible. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Charles was sentenced to 25 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. "It's not enough," I told Elizabeth as we stood on the courthouse steps. "25 years for what he did to my baby? It's nowhere near enough." "No," she agreed quietly. "But it's justice and it's protection. He can never hurt your children again." The trial had taken its toll on our entire family. Marianne suffered from nightmares, trust issues, and behavioral problems that broke my heart daily. Richard, at 3, was affected by the chaos, even though he couldn't understand the details. And I was struggling with depression, anxiety, and a crisis of faith that made it difficult to imagine any positive future. That's when salvation arrived in the form of Mrs. Augusta Bennett, headmistress of Bennett Academy for Girls in Harrisburg. She appeared at my door one November morning with an offer that would change our lives. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said after introducing herself, "I've been following your case in the newspapers, and I have a proposition that I hope will interest you." She explained that the academy sought experienced teachers who could serve as positive role models for students, many from troubled backgrounds themselves. "We provide housing for faculty families, excellent educational opportunities for faculty children, and most importantly, a chance to start fresh where your past doesn't define your future," she continued. When I asked why she would take such a risk on someone with my circumstances, her answer revealed the source of her compassion. "Because 25 years ago I was in a situation very similar to yours," she said quietly. "A young teacher married to a respected man who turned out to be a predator. The difference is I had no one to offer me a way out. I've spent the rest of my life ensuring other women have options I never had." We moved to Harrisburg in January 1970, leaving behind everything we had known for the promise of safety and new beginnings. The faculty housing at Bennett Academy was modest, but comfortable, a 3-bedroom apartment with access to the school's extensive grounds. More importantly, it was safe. For the first time in years, I could lock my doors at night without fear of what might be lurking in the darkness of my own home. Teaching at Bennett Academy proved to be exactly the healing opportunity Mrs. Bennett had promised. The girls who came to us were often struggling with their own trauma and family dysfunction, creating an environment where my experience as a survivor became an asset rather than a source of shame. "You understand us in ways other adults don't," 15-year-old Sarah told me during one of our counseling sessions. She had been sent to the academy after revealing that her stepfather had been abusing her. "I understand because I've been where you are," I replied honestly. "I know what it feels like to have the person who should protect you become the person you need protection from. But I also know that survival is possible and that what happened to you doesn't define who you become." Under Mrs. Bennett's guidance, I developed programs for helping traumatized students rebuild their sense of safety and self-worth. We created support groups, implemented trauma-informed teaching methods, and established partnerships with mental health professionals. Marianne thrived in this protective environment. She received therapy from Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in sexual trauma recovery, and slowly began to heal from the wounds Charles had inflicted. "She's making remarkable progress," Dr. Chen reported after 6 months. "The nightmares are decreasing, her trust issues are gradually resolving, and she's beginning to develop age-appropriate relationships. Children who receive proper support after experiencing trauma can live completely normal, healthy lives. Richard grew up in this environment with no clear memories of our traumatic period, developing into a confident, curious boy who saw Bennett Academy as simply home rather than a refuge. As for me, I discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. Mrs. Bennett gradually increased my responsibilities, eventually promoting me to assistant headmistress in charge of student welfare and trauma recovery programs. For the first time in my adult life, I was defining myself by my own achievements rather than by my relationship to a man. I was Josephine Mitchell, educator, an advocate, survivor, and healer. It was in this context of growing strength that I met Sebastian Torres in the spring of 1973. He was the Academy's new groundskeeper, a quiet man in his early 40s who had recently returned from military service in Vietnam. My first real conversation with him happened on a warm April afternoon when I found him reading during his lunch break beside the fountain in our main courtyard. "Is that Hemingway?" I asked, recognizing the worn cover. He looked up startled. "Yes, ma'am. I hope it's all right that I'm reading here." "Please don't move," I said, settling beside him. "It's refreshing to find someone who reads for pleasure." Sebastian smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Books were my lifeline during the war," he said simply. "They could transport me away from everything else when I needed to remember that beauty still existed." Our friendship developed gradually over shared conversations about literature, quiet walks through the Academy grounds, and mutual respect for boundaries. Sebastian never pushed for more intimacy than I was ready to give, showing infinite patience with my wariness around men. "I was married before," I told him one evening. "It ended very badly." "I figured as much," he said quietly. "A woman doesn't come to a place like this with 2 children unless she's escaping something difficult." "Does it bother you, not knowing the details?" Sebastian considered this seriously. "Everyone carries scars from their past, Josephine. What matters to me is who you are now, not what you survived to become this person." His acceptance of my privacy was a gift I had never expected. Charles had demanded access to every thought and feeling. Sebastian was content to let our relationship unfold naturally. The children's reactions were different, but predictable. Marianne, now 11 and still struggling with trust issues around men, was initially suspicious. "Why is Mr. Torres always here?" she asked one day, anxiety in her voice. "Because he's my friend," I explained carefully. "Friends enjoy spending time together." "But he's a man," she said, as if that explained everything. "Yes, he is. Does that frighten you?" Marianne thought for a long moment. "A little. Men can pretend to be nice and then hurt you when nobody's watching." Her words broke my heart because they revealed how deeply Charles's betrayal had damaged her ability to trust. "Some people do hurt others," I said gently. "Both men and women can be dangerous, but most people are good, and some are truly wonderful. Mr. Torres is one of the good ones." "How can you tell the difference?" "Because I watch how he treats everyone he encounters, not just me, but you and Richard, Mrs. Bennett, the delivery workers, even the stray cats. He's kind and respectful to everyone, whether they have power or not, whether anyone important is watching or not. That's how you recognize genuine character." It took nearly a year for Marianne to warm up to Sebastian, but his patient consistency gradually earned her trust. He never tried to parent her or replace the father figure she had lost, instead treating her as an intelligent person worthy of respect. Richard, who had no clear memories of Charles, took to Sebastian immediately. He would follow our groundskeeper around the Academy's property, chattering about everything that crossed his mind, and absorbing Sebastian's gentle lessons about the natural world. Our courtship lasted 3 years. Sebastian never pressured me for physical intimacy or emotional declarations I wasn't ready to make. He simply became part of our daily lives, naturally showing up when we needed him and giving us space when solitude was required. The first time he kissed me was on Christmas Eve of 1975, after we had decorated the Academy's main hall. The children had fallen asleep on one of the couches, and we found ourselves alone under the mistletoe. "Josephine," he said softly, and I could see the question in his eyes, along with patient willingness to accept whatever answer I gave. I responded by rising to meet his lips with mine, And the kiss that followed was everything Charles's possessive claiming had never been gentle, respectful, and freely given, rather than demanded. "I love you," Sebastian whispered when we broke apart. "I have for months now. But I need you to know that I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give." "I love you too," I replied, surprised by how easily the words came. I didn't think I would ever feel safe enough to love anyone again, but somehow you've made it possible. We were married the following spring in the Academy's chapel, with Mrs. Bennet officiating and only our closest friends attending. Marianne served as my maid of honor, while Richard walked Sebastian down the aisle with serious dignity. This time, when I said "I do," the words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom rather than naive hope. I knew exactly who I was marrying and what kind of partnership we were creating, one based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the understanding that love should heal rather than harm. Our marriage proved to be everything my first one had pretended to be. Sebastian was a true partner who shared responsibilities without being asked, supported my career without feeling threatened, and treated my children as if they were his own flesh and blood. After our wedding, Sebastian legally adopted both Marianne and Richard, giving them his name and the security of knowing they had a father who had chosen to love them unconditionally. We had 18 wonderful years together before cancer began its conquest of Sebastian's body in 1994. He faced his illness with quiet dignity, more concerned about how we would cope after his death than about his own suffering. "Promise me something," he said during his final weeks. "Promise me you won't let my dying make you forget how to live. You have too much to offer the world to waste it on extended grief." "I promise," I whispered, though I couldn't imagine how I would keep that vow. Sebastian's death in early 1995 was devastating, but it didn't break me the way Charles's betrayal had. The love we had shared was so genuine and complete that it became a source of strength rather than weakness, a foundation I could build upon, rather than wreckage I needed to escape. I mourned him properly and deeply, and then I did exactly what he had asked. I kept living. I am 87 years old now, writing these final words from the apartment where Sebastian and I spent our happiest years. The walls are covered with photographs that tell the story of a life redeemed, pictures of Marianne receiving her law degree, of Richard graduating from medical school, of grandchildren who carry within them no trace of the trauma that once threatened to destroy our family's future. Marianne became exactly what she set out to be, a fierce advocate for children and families affected by abuse. She specializes in family law with a focus on child protection, and over her career has helped hundreds of families escape dangerous situations and rebuild safely. She married David, a gentle pediatrician who shares her commitment to protecting vulnerable children, and together they raised 2 daughters who grew up knowing they were loved unconditionally. "Mom," Marianne told me on her 50th birthday, "I need you to know something important. What Charles did to me, it doesn't define me anymore. It's just one chapter in my story, and not even close to the most important one." Richard became a pediatric oncologist who has dedicated his career to helping children and families navigate life-threatening illness. His work honors Sebastian's memory and the lessons about resilience that shaped his childhood. He married Elena, a social worker, and they have 3 children who call me Grandma Josie and fill my later years with laughter and joy. "You know what I remember most clearly about growing up?" Richard asked me recently during one of our Sunday dinners. "Not the scary parts from when I was really little, but the feeling of being completely safe and loved at the academy. You and Sebastian created a home where we could heal and grow into whoever we were meant to become." As for me, I spent 30 years as headmistress of Bennett Academy, transforming it into a nationally recognized center for trauma-informed education and family healing programs. We developed innovative approaches to helping children recover from abuse, trained teachers and social workers from across the country, and provided safe haven for hundreds of families seeking to escape dangerous situations. In 1995, we established the Torres Family Foundation, providing scholarships for abuse survivors seeking higher education and funding programs that support families in crisis. The foundation has helped more than 1,000 young people pursue degrees and professional training that might otherwise have been impossible. Perhaps my greatest achievement has been the simple fact that our family broke the cycle of violence that might otherwise have continued for generations. My children learned what healthy love looks like, and they passed that knowledge to their own children, creating a legacy of healing that will extend far beyond my own lifetime. To anyone reading this who recognizes themselves in our story, whether as a survivor, a family member, or someone who suspects abuse is occurring in their community, I want you to know that healing is possible, justice can be achieved, and hope exists even in the darkest circumstances. The warning signs of abuse are often subtle, but consistent children who become withdrawn or fearful around specific adults, who display sexual knowledge inappropriate for their age, or who speak of special secrets they're not supposed to share. Adults who seek excessive alone time with children who give lavish gifts without occasion, or who seem to have special relationships with minors that exclude other adults, should be watched carefully and questioned directly. If you are currently in an abusive situation, please know that help is available and that escape is possible with proper planning and support. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, operates 24 hours a day and can help you develop a safety plan and connect with local resources. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, 1-800-422-4453, provides similar support for children and families dealing with abuse. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate it. If someone seems dangerous, take precautions. If a child tells you they're being hurt, believe them and act immediately to ensure their safety. We all have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable members of our society, and we all have the power to be the person who makes the difference between a victim's continued suffering and their eventual salvation. My story had a happy ending because people chose courage over comfort when it mattered most. Mrs. Catherine called for help when Marianne came to her door. Sheriff Davis took a child's testimony seriously, despite social pressure to dismiss it. Mrs. Bennett offered sanctuary when we needed a fresh start. Sebastian loved us without trying to fix or change us. Dr. Chen provided the professional expertise that made healing possible. Each of these people made a conscious choice to act with compassion and courage, and their choices changed the trajectory of our lives forever. You have the power to be that person for someone else. Use it wisely. Use it bravely, and never underestimate the difference your intervention could make. The human spirit is remarkably resilient when nurtured with love, support, and the knowledge that we are not alone in our struggles. What happened to us was terrible, but what we built from the ashes has been beautiful beyond anything I could have imagined when I stood in that hallway with scissors in my trembling hand. This is my legacy, not the trauma we survived, but the healing we achieved and the hope we've been able to offer others facing similar darkness. This is what redemption looks like, taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and transforming it into the best thing you ever accomplished. With love and hope for a future where every child is safe and every survivor knows they are not alone.